The night the river broke its banks, the sky turned the color of worn steel, and the air carried that heavy stillness that warned something was coming. Folks in the valley knew the land well enough to read its moods, but no one sensed the danger faster than the old rancher standing alone on his porch. He watched the clouds roll low over the hills and felt a familiar unease tighten in his chest. He had lived on that ranch longer than he cared to count, long enough to know that when the wind fell quiet and the birds hid away, trouble was never far behind. The river had been rising for days, and he feared this storm might be the one that pushed it over the edge. He grabbed his coat and stepped into the yard, boots sinking into the soft earth. The sound of distant thunder rolled across the open fields, but what caught his attention was the faint cry drifting over from the far end of the property. It wasn't the storm, it wasn't the wind, it was something alive, something in trouble. He paused, listening again, and the sound came clearer this time, a horse calling out, sharp and panicked. His heart jolted. He knew that voice. It belonged to the young mare he had taken in not long ago, a gentle creature with a wild spark and a coat that shone like a polished chestnut. She was skittish around most folks, but she had always kept a quiet connection with him, watching him from the fence line with wide, wondering eyes. The rancher hurried toward the old barn at the edge of his land, the one built near the small river that ran behind the property. The river wasn't usually dangerous, just a steady stream cutting through the valley, but storms like this could turn it into a torrent capable of swallowing anything in its path. His boots splashed through puddles as the wind picked up, pushing against him with cold force. That cry came again, louder, desperate, fear rooted in him then. If the mare was trapped, the rising water would only make things worse. As he reached the hill that overlooked the barn, he froze. The lantern he had left, hung outside the barn door, swung wildly, barely holding on. Worse, water had already begun pooling around the base of the barn, swirling in muddy circles. It was rising fast, faster than he had seen in years. A sick feeling settled in his stomach. He muttered a prayer under his breath and broke into a run. Inside the barn, the mare fought against the rising water, kicking and pressing back toward the far wall, eyes wide with fear. She was stuck behind a fallen beam that had broken loose when the first wave of water hit the building. The rancher slogged through knee-deep water to reach her, calling to her in the same calm voice he had used when she first arrived at the ranch. She blinked at him, recognizing him, and stopped thrashing just long enough for him to reach the broken beam. He tried lifting it, but the wood was soaked and heavy, refusing to budge. The water climbed to his thighs. The storm outside cracked open with a flash that lit the barn like a burst of fire. He had no time. He grabbed a rusted crowbar from a nearby shelf and wedged it under the beam. His arms trembled from effort and the weight of the wet wood, but slowly, inch by inch, the beam lifted enough for the mare to slip free. She stumbled, nearly falling into him, and he wrapped an arm around her neck to steady her. Her breath blew warm against his face, trembling with fear but trusting him fully in that moment. The building groaned as another surge of water pushed against its walls. The rancher guided the mare toward the door, urging her to step carefully through the swirling water. She hesitated at the threshold, frozen by the storm outside, but he pressed his forehead gently against hers and whispered a soft reassurance. This gave her the courage she needed. Together they stepped out into the pouring rain. The current was rough, pushing hard against their legs as they tried to reach higher ground. The mare braced herself next to him, keeping close enough that he could feel the vibration of her heartbeat. He knew she could bolt at any second if panic overtook her, but she stayed by his side, matching his pace through every dangerous step. Lightning lit up the sky again, revealing the path to the stable on the hill. That was their goal. If they could reach it, they'd be safe. Each step grew harder as the water tugged at them, but they pushed forward. When they reached the slope, the rancher grabbed the mare's mane lightly, helping guide her up the hill. Near the top, he slipped and fell to one knee. Mud slid under him, threatening to drag him back down. He clenched his jaw, trying to get up, but his body was giving out. Before he could fall, the mare leaned into him, pressing her weight against his shoulder, keeping him steady. He stared at her in stunned disbelief. She didn't run, she didn't leave him behind. She held him up until he regained his footing. When they finally reached the safety of the hilltop stable, the rancher pushed open the door and ushered her inside. He shut the door against the storm and sank onto a wooden crate, chest heaving, lungs burning. The Mireille stood before him, dripping wet, shivering lightly, but alive. He whispered thanks under his breath, part prayer and part relief. She walked toward him slowly, stopping inches from his knees, lowering her head until it rested gently against his chest. It almost knocked the breath out of him. Horses had shown him trust before, but this was something deeper, something quiet and full of meaning. He could feel her heart slow down, matching the rhythm of his own. She was thanking him in the only way she knew how, and the weight of that gratitude settled so heavily in his chest that he felt his eyes sting. The storm roared outside. Trees bent under the wind, and the river surged with a strength that would have swept them both away if they had been a few minutes later. Inside the stable, though, it was calm. The rancher lifted his hand and placed it on the Mare's neck, smoothing her soaked coat. Her breath warmed his shirt, and the soft sound she made seemed almost like a sigh of relief. Yet, even in that quiet moment, something tugged at the back of his mind, a feeling he couldn't shake. The barn had fallen faster than it should have. The river had never risen that high before, and the beam that trapped the Mare seemed too deliberate to be blamed on the storm alone. As he stared out the stable window at the dark fields below, a shadow moved across the lower ridge. A figure he couldn't make out through the sheets of rain. His breath caught. Someone had been near the barn earlier that evening. Someone who slipped away when he called out. Someone who had reasons that had nothing to do with the weather. The rancher stood slowly, giving the Mare one last reassuring pat. Whatever had happened tonight was no accident, and whoever had been on his land was still out there, hiding in the storm. He didn't know why. He didn't know what they wanted. But he knew one thing for certain. This night was only the beginning. The storm moved on by morning, leaving the ranch soaked and scarred. The river had calmed, but the mud it dragged across the land made every step heavy. The rancher walked out of the stable with stiff legs and tired eyes, still replaying the night in his mind. The Mare stood close by, her coat beginning to dry, though patches of mud clung to her legs. She watched him with a steady gaze, as if sensing he wasn't just tired from the rescue. He was thinking hard, too hard for a man who had barely slept. He went to check the barn first. The damage was far worse now that daylight revealed the truth. The whole back section had caved in, and large pieces of debris were scattered across the swollen mud. It looked like destruction caused by the storm, but he kept noticing details that felt off. A corner beam had a clean break that didn't match the splintered edges around it. A latch on the side door was twisted like someone had forced it open before the worst of the rain. Footprints mixed with boot marks had been washed out in places but were still visible in the softer patches. He crouched down, running his rough fingers lightly over one of the prints. Too big to be his. Too deep to belong to someone light. Whoever had been there wasn't passing through by chance. They had stood around long enough to leave several clear impressions before the rain had turned the ground to sludge. The Mare let out a soft sound behind him, almost like a warning. He glanced back at her, standing in the sunlight, her ears turned sharply toward the woods beyond the fence line. She sensed something. Horses often did before people caught on. He followed her gaze and saw nothing at first. Yet the feeling from last night returned like a shadow, sliding over his thoughts. Someone had been there. He wasn't imagining it. He spent the next hour trying to piece together what could have driven someone to sneak onto his land during a storm. The Mare had no enemies. She was too new to the ranch and had no history with anyone around. His other horses were all accounted for. Nothing else seemed disturbed. But the broken beam that trapped her looked too deliberate. It was wedged in a way that didn't feel natural. He walked around it again, studying the angle. It was as if someone wanted her stuck long enough for something to happen before he arrived. Rain began falling lightly again, and the rancher stepped back, brushing mud off his hands. He wasn't the kind to chase wild theories. Years of working the land had taught him to stick to what he could see, what he could hear, what he could prove. But this situation didn't fit into anything simple. Something had happened last night, something more than a flooded barn and a trapped horse. As the day went on, neighbors stopped by to check on him. They had seen the river rising and knew he lived close enough to be affected. One man asked if he lost any animals. Another offered help rebuilding the barn. The rancher nodded along, thanking them, but he didn't mention the figure he'd seen in the rain or the prints near the barn. People in the valley talked fast. Rumors moved even faster. He didn't want wild stories spreading until he knew more. Yet each visitor brought new words about folks seen driving through the valley late at night, strangers looking for something or someone. One neighbor said he spotted an unfamiliar wagon near the ridge road 2 days back. Another said he heard wood cracking during the storm, louder than a falling tree. None of them thought twice about it. Storms had a way of creating noises that didn't make sense. Still, every story added weight to the unsettled feeling inside him. By late afternoon, the rancher turned his attention back to the mare. She needed checking for injuries, though she seemed stronger now that she rested. He cleaned the dried mud off her legs and checked her sides for bruises. She flinched once when he touched her shoulder. A dark patch of skin showed under her coat, likely from where the beam pinned her. He stroked her gently, speaking in a low voice to calm her. She leaned into his hand, warm and trusting. He remembered the way she had supported him on the hill the night before, her weight steady against him when he nearly slid backward. It struck him again how unusual that was. A new horse, especially one with a wild streak, should have saved herself first. Instead, she stayed by him. He felt a kind of bond forming between them, quiet but strong. It made the thought of someone trying to harm her even harder to stand. As he worked, something on her flank caught his eye. A faint mark hidden beneath her coat. A smudge that looked different from mud or dirt. He wiped at it gently. The mark didn't smear or flake off. It was an old brand, not a ranch brand. Something else. The design was faint, almost weathered away, but enough of the shape remained to make out a circle and a broken line through it. He didn't recognize it. His hand paused. Brands told stories. They held histories. If she had belonged to someone before, it meant she wasn't just a stray he had taken in. Someone once claimed her. And if that someone discovered where she ended up, maybe last night wasn't random at all. He stared at the mark for a long moment, trying to place it. He had seen hundreds of brands over the years, some from old ranches long gone, others from traveling breeders, traders, and drifters, but this one was odd, too simple, too rough. It didn't belong to a well-known ranch. It looked like something done in secret, not meant to be tracked easily. He stepped back, wiping his hands on his jeans. If she had a past, it might not be a peaceful one. Horses with unusual branding often came from illegal trades or old disputes between ranchers trying to settle debts in harsh ways. He had heard stories of horses stolen in the middle of the night, taken far from home, moved through hidden routes to avoid attention. He hoped she wasn't one of those cases, but the mark raised questions he wasn't ready to answer. As the sun dipped lower, he set out hay for her and watched her eat. The barn rebuild could wait until he figured out why someone would be near his land in the storm. He didn't like unsolved things sitting in his mind. They never quieted until he found the truth. And now the mare's mysterious mark had added another layer to the puzzle? He stepped outside the stable and scanned the horizon. The valley stretched out calm and washed clean by the storm, but the quiet didn't comfort him the way it usually did. The woods along the ridgeline were still. The fence was intact. Everything looked normal, yet he knew better. Trouble often hid behind normal things until it was ready to show itself. He walked the property until the sky turned dark, checking gates, fence lines, and any sign of recent movement. A few spots near the woods showed disturbed soil, like someone had walked through earlier. He crouched to inspect them, his jaw tightening. The tracks were fresh, not old. Not washed away by the storm. These were made after the rain stopped. Someone had returned. He stood slowly, turning toward the stable. The mare was safe for now, but safety didn't last long when someone had a reason to come back. And if they were bold enough to show up again after last night, they were planning something more. He walked back to the stable door and slid the lock in place. The mare lifted her head at the sound, her ears flicking forward. He gave her a reassuring nod, even though his thoughts were anything but calm. This was no simple accident, no storm mishap. Someone had unfinished business with that mare, and whatever story she carried on her skin was going to pull him into trouble he hadn't asked for. He didn't know how deep that trouble ran, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: the storm wasn't over. The real one was just beginning. The wind shifted that night in a way that felt almost deliberate. The old rancher noticed it as he stepped onto his porch, his boots brushing against dry boards that groaned with each step. The air had a rough edge to it, a warning carried across the land that something unseen was moving closer. He looked out over the dark stretch of fields, eyes sharp even in the thin moonlight, and something inside him tightened. He had lived with storms, wild seasons, and long periods of silence, but this feeling was different. It was as if the land itself was holding its breath. The horse, the same frightened creature he had pulled from the flooded barn, had grown calmer, yet her eyes still held a question he could not answer. She stood near the fence, shifting her weight and flicking her ears toward the far end of the ranch. She sensed things before he did. Animals always did. He took a quiet step toward her, watching the way she lifted her head and stared at the shadows. It almost felt like she was expecting someone, or something, to appear. He rubbed her neck and whispered that she was safe here, though a part of him wondered if he was promising more than he understood. Saving her had felt simple in the moment, driven by instinct and fear of losing another life to that violent storm. But now the axe seemed to have cracked open a door that had been shut for years. The land was waking up old memories, and with them came trouble he thought he had buried long ago. That evening, while he checked the barn and replaced a few broken boards, he noticed tracks in the mud behind the stables, not hoof prints, boot prints, fresh ones. They cut across the property in a straight line, not wandering or accidental. Whoever left them had been moving with purpose. He knelt down to study them, his jaw tightening as the dirt shifted under his fingers. They were deep, the kind made by someone who carried weight, emotional or physical. He stood slowly and scanned the horizon, feeling that same steady pressure in the air. Someone had been here, and they were not just passing through. The horse paced behind him, restless again. She snorted and tossed her head as if she recognized a scent that unsettled her. He walked to her and placed a hand on her cheek to calm her, but she kept looking past him at the tree line that bordered the ranch. Her breathing quickened, not out of fear, but anticipation. He had seen that same look in cattle when a predator lurked near the herd. This was not a simple visit. Something was stalking the edges of his quiet life, and this horse seemed to know more about it than he did. Later that night he made coffee even though he did not plan on sleeping. He sat at his old kitchen table, lit by a single lamp, and tried to make sense of the unease that clung to the walls. The house felt smaller than usual, as if the world outside was pressing inward. His eyes drifted to the door more than once. The silence made him more alert, sharpening every sound. Even the smallest creak in the hallway seemed louder than it should have been. He thought about the flooded barn and how the horse had been trapped. The storm had come down fast, but the damage had been strangely targeted. The rest of his property was drenched but largely intact, except for that one barn. Something about it sat wrong in his mind. He replayed the moments he had fought to get her out, how she had been wedged in the corner as if something had driven her there. He remembered her wild eyes and how she trembled, not just from cold but from something deeper. She had looked cornered, not simply trapped. The next morning, he rode out along the fence line on an old gelding he trusted with his life. The rescued horse remained behind the gate, watching them leave. He followed the path the mysterious tracks had taken, noting each spot where the grass had been disturbed or the earth pressed down. The trail led toward an abandoned cabin on the far end of his land, a place he had not visited in years. The building leaned to one side now, worn down by storms and time. He dismounted and approached the front steps, his boots pushing through tall weeds. The door hung open just wide enough to suggest someone had slipped inside. He nudged it with the toe of his boot, and it swung inward with a slow groan. The air smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic. He stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light that filtered through broken windows. Nothing looked touched at first. Dust lay thick on the old furniture, and the floor was littered with fallen leaves. But there was a mark on the wall that caught his attention. a handprint, fresh and smeared as if the person had been in a hurry. He felt the familiar burn of old instincts rising back to the surface. He had tried to leave that part of his life behind, the part that recognized danger long before others noticed it. But the ranch had a way of drawing out the truth, no matter how deeply it had been buried. He walked through the cabin slowly, being careful not to disturb anything. He reached the back room and froze when he saw a pile of rope on the floor. It was the same kind he kept in his barn. Someone had taken it, used it here, then left it behind. His mind flashed back to the horse again. The way she had been cornered, the way she had panicked, the way someone's presence had felt ingrained in the air of the barn. This was no coincidence. Someone had taken an interest in her before he even knew she existed. And now they were returning, step by step. When he returned to the ranch, the sun was dipping low and the horse was pacing anxiously near the gate. She ran to him the moment he stepped onto the dirt, her entire body trembling. He placed his hands on her neck and whispered to her again, though his own heart felt unsteady. He could feel her fear, but also something else. Trust. She trusted him with something she could not explain. That trust made the weight of the moment heavier. He looked around the silent fields, every shadow feeling sharper than it had ever been. The land looked peaceful, but deep down he knew it was only a mask. Something was coming toward him, toward her, and the ranch would not stay quiet for long. Night settled again, darker than before, and he stayed outside with her, standing by the fence with a lantern that flickered like it wanted to give up. She pressed her head against his shoulder for a brief moment, and he felt a wave of emotion he could not name. He had saved her, yes, but now it felt like she was saving him from drifting back into loneliness and silence. A crack echoed from the tree line, sharp and deliberate. Not a branch snapping on its own, not a random noise. It was a signal, a warning. Someone was out there, hidden among the shadows, watching him and the horse with a patience that sent cold pressure crawling up his spine. He tightened his grip on the lantern and stepped forward, his eyes locked on the darkness at the edge of his land. The horse took a step closer to him, her breath quick and warm against the cold night air. He whispered that they would face whatever came next together. But the shadow in the trees did not move, did not speak, did not reveal itself. It simply waited, and he understood all at once that this was only the beginning of something far bigger than he had imagined. The piece of the ranch was slipping away. The danger was already here. And the person hiding in the dark was not planning to leave until they got what they wanted? The old rancher felt a shift in the ground beneath him, a silent promise from the land that the calm days were over. Whatever was coming for them would not be stopped easily, and the bond between him and the horse would be tested in ways neither of them could see yet. He did not turn back. He stood firm, eyes fixed on the darkness, knowing the next moment could change everything. And then the wind moved again, carrying a sound across the field. A voice, low, familiar, calling his name. The voice drifted across the field so softly that at first he thought the wind was fooling him. It carried his name in a stretched tone that pulled at something deep inside him. He stood still for a moment, trying to steady his breathing as he listened again. The horse pressed closer, nudging his shoulder as if urging him back toward safety. He kept a hand on her neck, feeling the quick rhythm of her heartbeat, but his attention never left the tree line. He called out asking who was there, though every part of him expected no answer. For a moment, the silence returned. The ranch felt frozen. Even the faint rustle of the dry grass seemed to hold back. Then the voice came again, a little clearer, as if whoever it belonged to had stepped closer. The rancher recognized something familiar in the sound, a tone that brushed against old memories he had tried to forget. It set a pressure in his chest that felt heavier than any fear. He took a few steps forward, lantern light shifting across the dirt like a drifting signal of its own. The horse followed him until the end of the fence, pacing a small circle as she watched him with wide, worried eyes. He turned back for a moment, as if asking her to trust him, then faced the trees again. The voice called his name once more, this time sounding strained, almost desperate. He knew then that whoever was hiding was not trying to lure him by force. They were communicating something else, something mixed with warning. The old rancher walked closer to the tree line, stopping just before the shadows swallowed the light. He waited, letting the silence stretch between them. When the voice spoke again, it came from deeper within the dark, as though the speaker kept shifting back each time he approached. It was a name he had not heard in years, belonging to someone he had once known well, someone he believed had left this land for good. The wind picked up and snapped a broken branch near his feet. The sudden sound spooked the horse, and she let out a sharp call behind him. He turned to check on her, and when he looked back toward the trees, the voice had fallen quiet again. A shape moved between the shadows, not enough to see the face, but enough to know he was not imagining things. He started to walk backward, unwilling to step farther into the dark. As he returned to the horse, she pushed her head against him again, shaking with worry. He whispered to her, trying to calm both her and himself. He felt eyes on them even after they reached the porch, and he knew the night would not offer rest. He sat outside until the first bit of light crept over the horizon, never seeing the figure step out, never hearing the voice again, but always feeling the presence. The next morning he saddled the gelding and rode out early, leaving the rescued horse safely in the corral. She watched him with intense focus, pacing the fence as if she feared he would disappear. He promised he would return soon, and though she could not understand his words, she seemed to understand the weight of them. He rode toward the far edge of the ranch, where the land dipped into a narrow valley. Tracks showed up in the soft dirt again, the same heavy boot prints as before. But this time there were more of them. Whoever had been walking across his property was now circling back and forth, spending more time here than before. He followed the tracks carefully, noting where they doubled back. The footsteps led toward the creek that had flooded during the storm. The water level had dropped, but the ground still held a dark stain where the flood had reached. As he walked the creek bank, something caught his eye. A piece of torn fabric hung on a thorn bush, dark in color and worn at the edges. He tugged it free and turned it over in his hand. It looked familiar, far too familiar. He folded it slowly and tucked it inside his coat, the weight of memory sinking deeper with each step. He kept searching until the sun stood high above. The land was quiet except for distant birds and the soft push of water moving over rocks. But the stillness held a tension, like the ranch was bracing for something. He felt it in the air, in the dirt, in the way the trees swayed as if uneasy. On his way back he saw another sign, a set of hoof prints near the fence line that did not belong to any of his horses. They were fresh and pointed toward the barn, not away from it. The tracks stopped at the gate, right where the rescued horse had been pacing earlier that morning. His jaw tightened, and he reached for the latch slowly as if expecting someone to appear. The horse stood in the far corner of the corral, tail swishing, ears pinned with tension. She stared at the gate like something had stood there watching her. When she noticed him, she trotted toward him with a kind of relief. He checked the fence for breaks or tampering but found none. Whoever had ridden that other horse had not entered, but they had come close enough to unsettle her again. He spent the afternoon reinforcing the barn doors, tightening hinges, and stacking extra tools where he could reach them fast. The ranch was not a battlefield, but the way things were unfolding made him treat it like one. Every noise seemed sharper, every shift of the wind made him turn his head. Even the old dog who slept near the steps lifted her head more often, sniffing the air as if catching a scent she did not recognize. When night fell again, the rancher stayed outside with the rescued horse, keeping her near the barn where the lantern lights burned brighter. She remained glued to his side, trembling when distant sounds drifted across the field. He could tell she remembered the danger that had trapped her before, the danger that might still be stalking her. Hours passed with no movement. The night grew colder, and the lantern light flickered in soft rhythms. He leaned against the post and looked up at the sky, searching for some hint of clarity, but all he found was the same heavy silence pressing down on him. It was the kind of silence that warned of something approaching, something not yet visible but already taking shape. Then he heard the sound. Not the voice from the night before, not the cracking of branches. It was the steady rhythm of hoofbeats, slow, measured, coming from beyond the hills. His breath caught, and he turned toward the sound, his ears sharpening as the rhythm grew louder. The horse beside him went rigid. Her ears pointed forward, her legs locked, and she let out a low call filled with fear. The gelding in the stable began to stomp and snort, kicking the stall door as if trying to warn them. Even the old dog growled, her fur rising along her spine. The hoofbeats grew closer, echoing through the open fields like a drum. Someone was riding toward the ranch with purpose. Not hiding, not sneaking. They wanted to be heard. They wanted him to know they were coming. He stepped forward, lantern in hand, and watched the ridgeline. The sound grew louder still, and he felt the tension coil inside him tighter than ever. The horse pressed behind him, breathing hard. He whispered that she was safe, though he was no longer sure how much safety the ranch could offer. A dark shape appeared at the top of the ridge, then another behind it. Two riders, moving slowly, silhouetted against the faint glow of the rising moon. They paused at the crest of the hill, watching the ranch from a distance, unmoving, silent. The old rancher felt the weight of their stare even from far away. It burned through the darkness like a warning. The riders did not move closer. They simply waited, letting the tension stretch thin. The rancher stood firm, his boots set in the dirt, the lantern glowing in his hand. The rescued horse stayed close, her breath shaking against the cold air. The riders remained on the ridge, dark and still, as if letting him know there would be no more hiding. The moment he had been sensing, the moment the land had been whispering toward, was now standing in full view. And he understood with a sinking certainty that whatever they wanted was tied to the horse who now leaned against him, trusting him to keep her safe as danger gathered in quiet formation across the hills. The riders shifted slightly, readying their next move, and the tension thickened to its breaking point. The rancher tightened his grip on the lantern, heart pounding, breath steadying, knowing the night was about to change everything. But the riders did not turn back. They began to descend the ridge, closing the distance step by step, each hoofbeat carrying the story toward its breaking edge, dragging him and the horse into the heart of a conflict he could no longer outrun. And just when he thought they might stop or call out, they picked up speed, toward him, toward the horse, toward the truth he had been trying to escape for years. The climax was coming, and there was no turning away now. The riders thundered down the hill with a force that made the ground tremble under the old rancher's boots. He stood firm, lantern raised just high enough to keep the shadows from swallowing him. The horse beside him pressed her shoulder into his arm, trembling but refusing to leave him. She trusted him now, and that trust steadied him more than anything he carried in his hands. As the riders drew closer, the rancher finally recognized the man leading them. He felt his breath catch. The coat he wore, the way he held the reins, even the way his shoulders angled forward as he rode, it all washed over the rancher like a wave made of memory. It was someone he had thought gone forever, someone tied to a part of his past he rarely let himself revisit. The rider pulled his horse to a sharp stop only a few yards from the fence. Dust floated around him in a slow cloud. The second rider halted behind him. For a long moment nobody spoke. The rancher held the lantern between them, letting its warm light fall across the stranger's face. When he finally saw the truth, his heart dropped into his stomach. It was his late friend's son. The boy he had once helped raise after tragedy had struck their shared world. The boy who had left in anger years earlier, blaming the rancher for not being there when trouble reached their home. Time had hardened the young man's eyes, but the rancher could still see the familiar hurt behind them, the kind of hurt that never healed without understanding. The young man stared at the rescued horse as if seeing something that burned inside him. Then he spoke, his voice rough but not cold. He said the mare belonged to him. He said he had been searching for her ever since the storm swept through the valley. He said she had carried him for years, through better days and difficult roads, and when the storm hit, he had barely made it out alive. But she had vanished in the rising flood, leaving him to think she had been lost for good. Hearing his words, the rancher felt the weight lift from his chest. The mystery that had crept around the ranch was finally beginning to make sense. The tracks, the voice, the presence in the dark, they all came from someone who had once known this land like home. Someone who had returned not out of anger, but out of desperation to find the one companion he could not bear to lose. The mare stepped forward cautiously, lowering her head as she sniffed the air. The young man softened, sliding off his horse and standing still, leaving the choice in her hooves. The rancher watched, knowing what was unfolding was larger than any grudge, larger than the years that had pulled them apart. The Murray approached slowly, then pressed her head against the young man's chest with a gentle force that made him fall to his knees. He wrapped his arms around her neck, burying his face against her mane as his shoulders shook from relief. The rancher stepped back, giving them room. It was a reunion carved out by storms, loss, and hope. The kind of moment that reminded him why animals and people bonded in ways words seldom captured. The young man stayed on the ground for a long time, holding the horse as if anchoring himself back into a life he thought had slipped through his fingers. When he finally stood, he looked at the rancher with a mix of gratitude and guilt. He apologized for the past. He apologized for the broken words spoken in anger years ago. The rancher nodded, feeling a warm ache rise in his chest. He accepted the apology not because it was owed, but because the years had taught him that forgiveness held more strength than any wound. They talked beside the corral gate, lantern light flickering across their faces. The young man admitted he had used the last of his strength during the storm to search for the Murray, and when he found no sign of her, he walked for miles until he saw the dim lights of the ranch far across the hills. He had tried calling out that first night, too weak to come closer. When the rancher answered and the Murray cried from the barn, he realized he was on the right trail. But exhaustion swallowed him, forcing him to retreat when he wanted to push forward. The second rider stepped closer and explained he had helped guide the young man back to the ranch once he regained his strength. They had waited on the ridge to see whether the Murray was truly here before revealing themselves. Everything that had felt like danger now clicked into place. It was not danger at all. It was longing, loss, and a search for reunion. The rancher asked him what he planned to do now that he had found her. The young man hesitated. He said the Murray was safe here. He said she trusted the rancher and he did not want to tear her away from a place that had protected her. The rancher shook his head, placing a gentle hand on the horse's neck. He said the Murray had been waiting for her rightful companion. She had looked toward the hills every night as if trying to call someone home. The bond between them was unmistakable. The young man's eyes softened again. He ran his fingers through the Murray's mane and nodded. The decision settled naturally without force or fear. It was time for him to take her back and move forward with a clearer heart. Before leaving, the young man turned and asked the rancher if he could return one day to help with the land. He said he missed the soil, the smell of hay, the honest work of tending to animals. He said he was older now, ready to rebuild instead of run. The rancher gave a small smile, the kind that held years of history within it. He told him the ranch would always have room for him, not as a wanderer, but as someone who belonged. The morning sun rose with a warm glow across the fields as the riders prepared to leave. The mare stood tall, healthier than when the rancher had first found her in the flooded barn. She nudged him gently, as if thanking him in her own clear way. He pressed his forehead to hers and whispered that she had nothing to fear anymore. She had found her way back to her companion, and that was all he had hoped for. The young man mounted and steadied the reins. The Murray walked beside him with calm steps, her trust clear in every movement. They headed toward the open hills, the rising sun forming a soft path ahead of them. The rancher watched them go, feeling a quiet peace settle into his bones. He took a deep breath and looked across his land. The storm had taken much, but it had brought back something greater. It had pulled two lives back into each other's orbit, and had reminded him how kindness traveled farther than any road. The ranch felt lighter now, as if the soil itself had let go of its tension. As he walked back toward the barn, the old dog circled his legs, tail swaying. The rancher scratched behind her ears and smiled. The land was steady again. The mystery had given way to truth, and the truth had brought healing. He returned to his chores, each step filled with a quiet gratitude. He had saved a horse in need. He had protected her through fear and uncertainty. And in doing so, he had helped mend a bond broken by time and loss. The way the Murray had thanked him would stay with him forever, not because it brought tears to his eyes, but because it reminded him of what mattered most: compassion, trust, forgiveness, and the unspoken connection between people and the animals that carry them through life. The rancher lifted his face toward the morning sky. The day was fresh, the air calm, and the land at peace. and in that gentle silence, he felt the story come to rest exactly where it was meant to.